She was born with a curse on her lips. In 1519, in Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, a girl was born to the powerful Lorenzo II de Medici, Duke of Urbino. She was named Catherine. Her birth should have been a triumph. She was a descendant of bankers who became rulers, the great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the niece of the reigning Pope Leo X. The blood of Italy's most powerful family flowed in her veins. However, as astrologers claimed, the stars aligned in an ominous configuration on the day of her birth, and the prophecy began to unfold immediately. A few days after her birth, her mother died of puerperal fever. A week later, her father died of syphilis. The newborn Catherine, heir to an enormous fortune and a renowned name, was left a complete orphan. Her childhood was not a princess's fairy tale, but a political thriller. She was not a child, but an asset, a golden pawn in the great game for power in Italy. Her guardians were her powerful papal relatives, first Leo X and then Clement VII. They kept her with them in Rome, understanding that this girl's hand was the key to alliances and territories. But when a Republican uprising against Medici tyranny flared up in Florence once again, 8-year-old Catherine, who was in the city, was taken hostage. This was her first lesson in grand politics. She understood that her life was a bargaining chip. The rebellious citizens hated everything associated with the Medici. They debated what to do with the Duchessina, as they contemptuously called her. Some proposed displaying her on the city walls under the fire of the papal cannons besieging the city. Others, the most radical, suggested sending her to a brothel to utterly humiliate her family. She lived in a convent, but each day was a torture of anticipation. She heard the roar of cannon fire, the shouts in the streets, and fell asleep each night not knowing if she would wake up in the morning. It was there, in that monastic confinement, that she learned her most important art, the art of survival. She learned to hide her fear behind a mask of submission, to trust no one, to wait. When Florence fell, her uncle, Pope Clement VII, decided it was time to do something with this dangerous asset. She was 14 years old, and he found the most brilliant match in Europe for her. He arranged her marriage to the French prince Henry de Valois, the second son of King Francis I. For France, it was a beneficial alliance. It strengthened their position in Italy and brought a colossal dowry to the treasury. For the Pope, it was a way to ally with a great monarchy. And for Catherine, it was liberation from a cage. In 1533, she arrived in France. Her wedding in Marseille was incredibly lavish, but her honeymoon very quickly turned into an icy desert. The French court met her with ill-concealed disdain. To the refined, arrogant French aristocrats, she was an upstart, a merchant's daughter, la marchande, the child of bankers, not kings. Her Italian accent, her entourage, her love for art and new dishes, it was she, according to legend, who brought the fork and ice cream to France. All of this provoked ridicule. But her main misfortune was her husband. Henry, a somber and silent youth, was a few days older than her, and he was in love, but not with her. His heart was completely dominated by Diane de Poitiers, his former governess, a woman 20 years his senior. This tall, beautiful, imperious blonde was his only love, his goddess, his secret queen. The 14-year-old, short, not particularly beautiful Catherine, with her prominent Medici eyes, could not compete with her. Henry performed his marital duties, but his heart was with Diane. Catherine found herself in the humiliating position of a wife tolerated but not loved, forced to share her husband with an all-powerful favorite. Stories of women who, having endured humiliation and contempt, reach the heights of power are always fascinating. They show that the strongest armor is forged in the fire of suffering. On this channel, we seek precisely such biographies, tales of steely will hidden behind external fragility. To ensure you don't miss the story of how this Italian merchant's daughter became the most powerful woman in France and ruled the country for 30 years, make sure you subscribe. Now, let's return to the French court, where Catherine was to learn her next lesson. Infertility is a death sentence for a queen. Years passed, and she could not bear an heir. For 10 years, her marriage was childless. This was a disaster. Whispers of divorce were already circulating. For her, it would mean a shameful return to Italy, the end of everything. She was desperate. She consulted doctors, alchemists, and sorcerers. She drank foul concoctions, applied warm animal blood to her belly, all in vain. It was at this moment that her rival, Diane de Poitiers, made an unexpected move. Fearing that in the event of a divorce, Henry would marry someone who could displace her from power, she decided to help Catherine. She essentially taught the royal couple how to conceive children properly, giving them advice and even, according to rumors, spying on them to ensure they were doing everything correctly. And a miracle happened. After 10 years of barrenness, Catherine finally became pregnant. And then she began to bear children, one after another. 10 children in 12 years. She fulfilled her primary function. She gave the dynasty heirs. She bore 3 future kings of France, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. She bore the future Queen of Spain and the future Queen of Navarre. Her body, which had failed her for so long, became her main weapon, her guarantee of survival. But her position at court did not change. In 1547, the old King Francis I died. Her husband became King Henry II, and she became Queen of France. But it was only a title. The true queen remained Diane de Poitiers. It was she who received ambassadors, distributed titles, and influenced politics. Catherine remained in the shadows, a queen incubator, a woman whose sole task was to bear and raise children. She was silent. She observed. She learned. For 30 years, from the day of her arrival in France, she lived in the shadows. First in the shadow of her powerful father-in-law, then in the shadow of her husband and his all-powerful mistress. She was nobody, but she waited like a predator in ambush. And her hour arrived in 1559, on one of the most tragic and absurd days in French history. The summer of 1559 was a time of triumph for King Henry II. He had just concluded the long-standing Italian war with Spain, signing the advantageous Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis. To solidify this peace, 2 grand weddings were arranged: his daughter Elizabeth to King Philip II of Spain, and his sister Margaret to the Duke of Savoy. Paris was awash in luxury and festivities. The culmination was to be a grand nightly tournament held outside the walls of the Tournelles Palace. King Henry, who adored nightly games and considered himself an invincible fighter, decided to participate personally. Catherine de Medici was gripped by ill premonitions. She begged her husband not to enter the lists. Her court astrologer, the famous Nostradamus, had published his prophecies several years earlier, one of which stated, "The young lion will overcome the old. On the field of battle in a single duel, in a golden cage, he will pierce his eye, after which he will die a cruel death." Henry merely laughed at his wife's fears and the ravings of charlatans. He entered the tournament. He achieved several victories. The day was already drawing to a close, but the king, flushed with success, demanded one more, a final duel. His opponent was a young Scottish nobleman, Count Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his guard. They clashed at full gallop. The impact was so powerful that both lances shattered. But a splinter from Montgomery's lance, piercing the golden visor of the royal helmet, golden cage, plunged into Henry's head just above his right eye. The king fell from his horse. Unconscious and bleeding, he was carried to the palace. The best doctors in France and even the famous surgeon Vesalius, sent from Brussels, fought for his life. They even conducted experiments on the heads of executed criminals, trying to understand the nature of the wound. But all was in vain. The splinter of the lance had penetrated deep into his brain. After 10 days of agonizing suffering, in terrible torment, King Henry II died. For France, it was a catastrophe. But for 40-year-old Catherine de Medici, who had lived in the shadows for 30 years, this was her hour. At the very moment her husband breathed his last, she transformed from a humiliated wife into the most powerful person in the kingdom, the Queen Mother, regent for her eldest son, the 15-year-old sickly and utterly incapable of ruling, Francis II. Her first act was revenge. Cold, elegant, purely Italian revenge. She did not execute Diane de Poitiers, her eternal rival, who had just lost everything. She did worse. She humiliated her. She ordered her to return to the crown all the castles and jewels Henry had given her. She banished her from court and sent her to her estate, where she lived out her days in oblivion. The woman who had ruled France for 30 years was erased from history with a stroke of the pen by the one she had always despised. Catherine showed the court who was now the true mistress. But personal revenge was merely a prelude. She faced a task of monstrous complexity. She inherited a country that was not just weakened by war and financial crisis, it was pregnant with civil war. The religious Reformation, which began in Germany with Martin Luther, had reached France, but here it took the form of Calvinism. French Protestants, whom Catholics contemptuously called Huguenots, were growing in number. And these were not just commoner heretics. A significant portion of the aristocracy was converting to the new faith, including the most prominent figures in the kingdom, such as the Bourbon princes, Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, and his brother, the Prince de Condé, and Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. For them, Calvinism was not just a matter of faith, it was also an ideology of resistance. It gave them the right not to submit to an idolatrous king. The Huguenots created a powerful, extensive organization, a state within a state, with their own churches, armies, and leaders. They were opposed by an equally fanatical ultra-Catholic party, led by the powerful and ambitious House of Guise, Duke Francis de Guise, a hero of recent wars, and his brother, Cardinal of Lorraine. The Guises saw themselves as defenders of the true faith and dreamed of eradicating heresy, and secretly, perhaps, of the French crown. France was split into two irreconcilable armed camps, ready at any moment to tear each other apart. And between these two millstones lay a weak, wavering royal authority. Catherine de Medici was not a religious fanatic. She was a politician, raised in Renaissance Italy, where Machiavelli's ideas permeated the air. She viewed this conflict not from a theological perspective, but from a perspective of power. She understood that if one of the parties, the Guises or the Huguenots, achieved complete victory, it would destroy the other, and along with it, royal power, making it its puppet. Her primary, sole goal throughout her 30 years of rule would be to maintain balance. She would try to navigate between the two camps, supporting first one, then the other, preventing either from achieving final victory. She tried to be an arbiter in a deadly game where the rules were betrayal and murder. Her seesaw policy began from the very start. Under her weak son, Francis II, real power was seized by the Guises, relatives of his wife, the young Mary Stuart. They began a brutal persecution of the Huguenots. In response, the Huguenots organized the Amboise conspiracy, attempting to kidnap the king and remove the Guises from power. The conspiracy was uncovered, and its participants were brutally executed. They were hanged on the walls of Amboise Castle in front of the entire court. Catherine was horrified, but powerless. But then, fate intervened again, her eternal and grim ally. In 1560, after only 17 months of rule, young Francis II died of an ear infection. The throne passed to his 10-year-old brother, Charles IX, and Catherine de Medici became regent once more. This time, she was determined not to lose power. She removed the Guises, and to counterbalance them, began a policy of religious tolerance. She released Huguenot leaders from prison. She invited the famous Protestant theologian Theodore Beza to court and organized a colloquy, attempting to reconcile Catholics and Protestants. In January 1562, she issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, which for the first time in French history granted Huguenots the right to freedom of worship. Albeit with caveats, they could only hold their services outside city walls. It seemed peace was possible, but fanatics on both sides did not want peace. They wanted war. On March 1, 1562, Duke Francis de Guise, passing through the town of Voici with his retinue, encountered Huguenots holding their worship service in a barn inside the city, violating the edict. The Duke's retinue attacked the unarmed people. More than 50 people were killed, including women and children. The Massacre of Voici became the spark that ignited France. The Huguenots took up arms, the first of 8 wars of religion, which would plague the country for the next 30 years, began. Catherine found herself trapped. She vacillated between the two camps. She concluded truces that were immediately broken. She organized peace negotiations that ended in new murders. In one of the first wars, Francis de Guise was killed. Then, in another, the Huguenot leader, Prince de Condé. Their sons, even younger, even more furious and irreconcilable, replaced them, Henry de Guise and Henry of Navarre. The war became increasingly fierce. It was not just a war of armies, it was a war of neighbors. Catholics massacred Huguenots in one city. Huguenots massacred Catholics in another. The country drowned in blood. Catherine, seeing that her policy of moderation had failed, decided to take a desperate step. She decided to solidify the fragile peace with a dynastic marriage. She proposed marrying her daughter, Margaret de Valois, the famous Queen Margot, to the young Huguenot leader, Henry of Navarre. This was an unheard-of, scandalous plan. A Catholic princess was to marry a heretic. The Pope was furious. The ultra-Catholic party in Paris considered it a betrayal, but Catherine insisted. She believed that this marriage would be a symbol of reconciliation, that it would put an end to the bloodshed. In the summer of 1572, all the Huguenot nobility, led by Admiral Coligny, gathered in Paris for the wedding. Catholic Paris, which hated the heretics, watched them with dark, simmering malice. The atmosphere in the city was electrified, as before a thunderstorm. The wedding took place on August 18, but instead of a celebration of peace, it became a prelude to the most terrible massacre in French history. 4 days later, on August 22nd, as Admiral Coligny walked down the street, a shot from an arquebus rang out from a window of one of the houses. The admiral was wounded in the arm. The assassination attempt failed. Who was behind it? Was it the Guises, who wanted revenge for their father's death, for which they blamed Coligny? Or was it Catherine herself, who, having invited Coligny to Paris, feared his growing influence over her son, King Charles IX? Coligny was urging the king to go to war with Catholic Spain in the Netherlands, which for Catherine, always seeking peace with Spain, was a nightmare. Historians still debate this, but whoever the perpetrator, the consequences were catastrophic. The Huguenots gathered in Paris were enraged. They demanded an immediate investigation and revenge, threatening to take justice into their own hands. Catholic Paris, in turn, prepared for pogroms. Catherine and her son, King Charles, found themselves in a deadly trap. They were in the Louvre, surrounded by thousands of armed and enraged Huguenots. They were in a panic. It was at this moment, on the night of August 23-24, on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, that a fateful decision was made in the royal palace. What was it? Was it a pre-planned conspiracy, as Huguenot propagandists claimed, and the wedding merely a trap? Or was it a spontaneous, panicked decision made in an atmosphere of fear and threat? Most likely, the latter. Catherine, Henry de Guise, and other Catholic leaders, gathered in a secret meeting, decided to strike preemptively. They convinced the weak-willed, hysterical King Charles IX that the Huguenots were plotting to kill the entire royal family. "Kill them all," the king cried in a panic, "but kill them so that not one remains who could reproach me for it." The order was given. At dawn on August 24, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois church rang out. It was the signal that rang from the bell tower of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois at dawn on August 24, 1572, was not a call to morning prayer. It was a death knell announcing the demise of thousands and the birth of the black legend of Catherine de Medici. What began as a targeted political action, the elimination of a few dozen Huguenot leaders, turned within hours into a monstrous, uncontrollable bloodbath, one of the most terrible and shameful pages in French history. The first victim was Admiral Coligny. Henry de Guise, eager for revenge for his father, personally led the squad that burst into the house where the wounded admiral lay. His assassins stabbed the unarmed old man in his bed, then threw his body out the window to the waiting mob. Guise, descending, disdainfully prodded the corpse with his foot to confirm it was indeed him. "We've started well," he said. "Now let's continue." And Paris continued. The signal, given to soldiers and the royal guard, was taken up by the city militia and the Catholic mob. This was not just a mob. It was a mob that had been fueled by hatred for years by fanatical preachers. A mob that saw the Huguenots not just as heretics, but as agents of the devil, the cause of all ills, famine, wars, high taxes. And this mob, having received an unspoken permission from above, smelled blood and broke loose. What happened next was not war, but slaughter. Armed bands of Catholics with white crosses on their hats to distinguish their own broke into houses where Huguenots lived. Lists of their addresses had been compiled in advance. People were killed in their beds, with no mercy for women or children. They were dragged into the streets and beaten to death with clubs, swords, butcher knives. Infants were smashed against house walls. Women were raped over the bodies of their murdered husbands. The Seine, Paris's main river, ran red with blood for several days and was choked with corpses. The killings were accompanied by widespread looting. This was not only a religious massacre, but also a settling of personal scores, an opportunity to get rid of a creditor, an envious neighbor, or simply to rob a wealthy home. Paris descended into hell. King Charles IX himself, according to legend, was in the Louvre in a state bordering on madness. He would fall into hysterics, then, grabbing an arquebus, allegedly shoot at fleeing Huguenots from the window. His young brother-in-law, Henry of Navarre, and his cousin, Prince de Condé, the main Huguenot leaders, miraculously escaped. They were brought before the king, who, threatening them with a dagger, forced them to convert to Catholicism. They bought their lives at the cost of apostasy. Their retinue, hundreds of Huguenot nobles, who had come for the wedding and trustingly lodged in the Louvre under the king's protection, were hunted down in the palace corridors and killed right before the eyes of the court ladies. What was Catherine doing during this time? Where was the Queen Mother, the chief architect of this peace? She was in the Louvre. She saw everything. Was she horrified that her limited, special operation had turned into an uncontrollable massacre? Or did she watch with cold satisfaction as her enemies destroyed each other. Most likely, both. She was undoubtedly shocked by the scale and brutality of the violence. But she was also a pragmatist. She understood that there was no turning back, and she immediately began to act to bring the situation under control and use it to her advantage. When the massacre, which lasted 3 days in Paris, began to subside, she sent letters throughout France announcing a Huguenot conspiracy against the king, and that justice had been served in Paris. This became the signal for the provinces. A wave of killings swept across the country, through Orléans, Rouen, Toulouse, Bordeaux. In total, an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 people were killed in a few weeks. Europe was in shock. Protestant countries, England and the German principalities, were horrified and enraged. Queen Elizabeth of England, receiving the French ambassador, dressed in mourning and met him in icy silence. But the Catholic world rejoiced. In Rome, Pope Gregory XIII ordered Thanksgiving Masses and had a special medal struck in honor of this triumph of faith. Spanish King Philip II, the most ardent enemy of Protestantism, reportedly laughed heartily for the first time in years. Catherine, facing international condemnation, began feverishly to rewrite history. She tried to portray it as either a spontaneous outburst of popular anger or a necessary measure to suppress a conspiracy. She lied, equivocated, tried to save face. But the black legend of the Poisoner Queen, of the cunning Italian woman who lured the Huguenots into a trap and drowned Paris in blood, was born in those days. And this legend would haunt her until her death and for centuries to come. But did she achieve her goal? If her goal was to destroy the Huguenot movement with one blow, she suffered a crushing defeat. Yes, she decapitated the party, eliminating most of its leaders. But she created thousands of martyrs. The surviving Huguenots, gripped by horror and a thirst for revenge, realized that there could be no compromise with this power. The religious war flared up with new, unprecedented intensity. It became a total war for survival. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre did not end the war. It made it eternal. And it destroyed her own son. King Charles IX never recovered from the horror and guilt. His fragile psyche was broken. He saw the ghosts of the murdered everywhere. He could not sleep. He was tormented by nightmares. His health, already weak, rapidly deteriorated. Less than 2 years after the massacre, in 1574, he died of tuberculosis, in terrible torment, bleeding to death. "Oh, my mother," were, according to legend, his last words. Charles IX's death again forced Catherine to maintain power. The throne passed to her third, most beloved, most brilliant, and most depraved son, Henry. At the time of his brother's death, he was far away, in Poland. A year earlier, thanks to his mother's intrigues, he had been elected King of Poland. This was a diplomatic triumph for Catherine, but for Henry himself, the Polish crown was an exile. He hated this cold, barbaric country, its crude, drunken gentry who forced him, a French prince, to obey their laws. Upon learning of Charles's death, Henry, without a word to anyone, secretly, like a thief, fled his Polish kingdom. He rushed to France to claim another, more desired crown. Catherine was ecstatic. Henry was her hope, her pride. He was intelligent, educated, handsome, charming. She believed that he would finally become the strong king who could unite and save France. She was wrong again. Henry III was a man of extremes, woven from contradictions. He could display incredible bravery in battle, but in peacetime, he transformed into a pampered, capricious sybarite. He surrounded himself with a company of young, handsome favorites, mignons, whom he showered with titles and money, and whose provocative behavior, duels, scandals, lavish attire, shocked both the common people and the old aristocracy. At the same time, he was prone to fits of religious fanaticism, participating in processions of flagellant penitence, scourging himself until he bled, and the next day organizing debauched balls. He was incapable of the long, routine work of governing the state. France, which he inherited, was in agony. The religious war continued, but now a political crisis was added to it. Henry III had no children. His younger brother, Francis, Duke of Anjou, was also childless and soon died. The Valois dynasty, which had ruled France for 300 years, was dying out. And next in line for the throne, by law, was Henry of Navarre. The same Huguenot who had miraculously escaped the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, fled Paris, returned to his faith, and now led the Protestant army. For the Catholic majority in France, the prospect of seeing a heretic on the throne was unthinkable, and this led to the birth of a new, most terrible monster, the Catholic League. The League, led by the new Duke, Henry de Guise, son of the murdered Francis, was an ultra-Catholic, fanatical organization whose goal was to prevent a Huguenot from ascending the throne and to eradicate heresy. The League enjoyed immense popular support, especially in Paris, and, most importantly, received money and military aid from France's main enemy, Spain. In fact, France now had three forces, three Henrys, who were at war with each other: King Henry III, Henry of Navarre, and Henry de Guise. This period went down in history as the War of the Three Henrys. Catherine de Medici, already old, sick, and weary, darted between these three fires. She had lost control of her beloved son, who no longer listened to her advice. She saw how Henry de Guise, incredibly popular among the people, became the uncrowned king of Paris, posing a greater threat to her son than even the Huguenots. She tried to organize negotiations, reconcile, find a compromise. But her time was up. The era of subtle intrigues had given way to an era of brute force. In May 1588, Henry de Guise, defying the king's direct prohibition, made a triumphant entry into Paris. The city greeted him as a savior. The day of the barricades began. Parisians revolted against King Henry III, who was forced to ignominiously flee his own capital. He had lost everything, and in this humiliation, in this despair, he decided on a final, most desperate move. A move worthy of Catherine de Medici's student. He pretended to reconcile with Guise. He convened the Estates General at the Château de Blois and appointed Guise commander-in-chief of all the kingdom's armies. Guise was at the height of his power. He felt completely in charge. And then, on the morning of December 23rd, as he walked to meet the king, in a dark corridor of the castle, he was ambushed by 45 of the king's personal guards, the 45, and stabbed to death. His brother, Cardinal of Lorraine, was arrested and killed the next day. When Henry III came to inform his mother, who lay ill in her chambers in the same castle, Catherine was horrified. "What have you done, my son?" she exclaimed. "You have cut the kingdom in two." She, a master of secret intrigues, understood that this murder, committed so openly and treacherously, would not solve the problem. It would only unleash the final, most terrible war. She was right. The assassination of Guise, a martyr for the Catholic faith, sparked an explosion of indignation throughout France. The Catholic League declared the king a tyrant and deposed him. Henry III, expelled from most of his kingdom, was forced to do the unthinkable, forge an alliance with his enemy, the heretic Henry of Navarre. Catherine de Medici did not live to see this. A few days after Guise's assassination, in January 1589, she died. She died seeing everything she had fought for crumble. Her dynasty was doomed. Her country was torn apart. Her beloved son was on the verge of ruin. She passed away having lost her last battle. But even in dying, she remained a politician. "Love one another, my children," were, according to legend, her last words, addressed to the French people. Words she herself never followed. Catherine de Medici's death went almost unnoticed. France was too consumed by the agony of civil war to mourn or curse the old queen. Paris, under the control of the Catholic League, refused to bury her in the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis. Her body was hastily interred in Blois, and only years later were her remains transferred to Paris. She departed a world that seemed to immediately forget her. But who was this woman, hidden behind the sinister mask of the Black Queen, the Poisoner Queen, Madame Serpent? Was she the monster that Huguenot propaganda painted her to be? To understand her, one must return to her roots, to Medici Florence. She was not French, she was an Italian of the Renaissance. She grew up in a world where politics was an art, not a matter of morality. In Machiavelli's world, who, according to legend, dedicated his The Prince to her father, she believed not in the divine right of kings, but in the right of intellect and will. She was neither good nor evil in the usual sense of the words. She was a pragmatist. Her only religion, her only passion, was power. But not power for power's sake, but power as a tool to preserve the dynasty, to pass the crown to her children. Her entire life is the tragedy of a mother who desperately tried to keep the crown of France, too heavy for them, on the heads of her weak, sickly, degenerating sons. She was a desperate mother. Her letters to her children are full of tenderness, care, and anxiety. She worried about their illnesses, gave them advice, and tried to arrange their marriages. But this maternal love was poisoned by her political ambitions. She loved her children, but she also loved them as future kings. She used them like pieces on a chessboard. She married her daughter Elizabeth to the cruel, fanatic King Philip II of Spain. She married her younger daughter Margaret to the heretic Henry of Navarre, arranging a wedding that turned into a massacre. She was willing to sacrifice their happiness for state interest. And in the end, she lost them all. Her sons died one after another, leaving no heirs. Her daughters were unhappy in their political marriages. She, who fought so hard for her dynasty, became its last barren ruler, witnessing its agony. She was not a beauty. Her prominent Medici eyes and plump figure could not compete with the beauty of her rivals, such as Diane de Poitiers or Mary Stuart. But she possessed incredible charm, a lively intellect, and the ability to captivate. And she knew how to use the external trappings of power. She introduced the fashion for black at the French court, which she wore as a sign of eternal mourning for her husband. But this color only emphasized her mystery and power. Her court was the most brilliant in Europe. She adored festivities, balls, masquerades, and theatrical productions. But this was not merely entertainment. Each of her celebrations was a political spectacle, meticulously planned. She used them to reconcile warring factions, to demonstrate the grandeur of royal power, to distract the restless aristocracy from conspiracies. She created her famous flying squadron, a corps of the most beautiful and intelligent ladies-in-waiting, whom she used as spies and seductresses to glean secrets from courtiers and foreign ambassadors. She was a great patron of the arts. She brought to France not only Italian cuisine, but also the Italian Renaissance. She commissioned the construction of magnificent palaces such as the Tuileries. She collected paintings, tapestries, and books. She patronized artists and architects. But even here, her love for art was inseparable from politics. Art, for her, was a tool of propaganda, a way to glorify the Valois dynasty. And of course, her name is inextricably linked with mysticism, with the occult. She was accused of surrounding herself with sorcerers, alchemists, and astrologers. And this was true. Her chief confidant was the famous Nostradamus, whose vague prophecies she tried to decipher. Another close associate was the Florentine magician Cosimo Ruggieri. Was this merely superstition, typical of her era? Or did she, a woman devoid of real military and political power, try to find support in the supernatural world, in secret knowledge that she believed could give her power over fate? Her enemies claimed that she used poisons, the famous Medici poisons, to eliminate her opponents. There is no direct evidence of this, but in the atmosphere of total distrust and paranoia that reigned at her court, rumors of a poisoner queen seemed quite plausible. She herself created this image, the image of a mysterious, dangerous, all-knowing Italian woman capable of anything. And this image was part of her power. So who was she ultimately? The Black Queen who drowned Paris in blood, or a desperate mother saving a dynasty? The answer, as is always the case in history, lies somewhere in the middle, and it is far more complex. Was she guilty of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre? Yes, undoubtedly. Even if she did not plan a mass slaughter, but only the elimination of the Huguenot leadership, it was her panicked decision, her order, that opened the floodgates for popular anger and led to one of the most terrible tragedies in European history. This bloodstain cannot be washed from her name. But was she the monster that propaganda painted her to be? No. She was neither a religious fanatic like Philip II, nor a bloodthirsty tyrant reveling in violence. All her life, paradoxically, she strived for peace. She was a centrist politician, a politique as they were called in France. She sincerely believed that the only way to save the country was to find a compromise between Catholics and Huguenots, to preserve the unity of the kingdom, placing the interests of the state above religious strife. She issued edicts of tolerance, organized peace negotiations, and tried to solidify peace through dynastic marriages. But she lived in an era when fanatics on both sides did not want peace. They wanted total victory. And she, caught between a rock and a hard place, was forced to use their own weapons: cunning, betrayal, and violence. She can be compared to a doctor trying to treat a patient dying of two different diseases at once, giving him first one medicine, then another, and ultimately, perhaps, only exacerbating his suffering. But she, at least, tried to treat him, while others only wanted to dismember the patient. Her main tragedy was that of a mother. She fought for her children, for her Valois dynasty. But this dynasty was doomed. Her sons were weak, sickly, incapable of ruling, and, most importantly, incapable of producing an heir. She was like a woman desperately trying to hold a handful of sand, only for it to inexorably slip through her fingers. She died without seeing the end of the wars. She died believing she had lost everything. But history judged differently. A few months after her death, her last son, Henry III, was assassinated by a fanatical monk. The Valois dynasty became extinct, and the King of France, ironically, became the very man to whom she had married her daughter to reconcile the two camps, the Huguenot Henry of Navarre. To ascend the throne, he uttered his famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass," and converted to Catholicism. He became King Henry IV, one of the greatest monarchs in French history. He ended the wars of religion by signing the Edict of Nantes, which granted Huguenots freedom of worship. In essence, He implemented the very policy of peace and compromise that Catherine had so desperately, albeit clumsily, striven for. He was her last, most successful, posthumous student. Catherine de Medici did not save the Valois dynasty, but perhaps unknowingly, she saved France. For 30 years, maneuvering, betraying, killing, she prevented the country from completely falling apart. She preserved the very idea of a unified, centralized kingdom, which Henry IV inherited. She was a bridge, albeit a shaky, bloody one, spanning the most terrible chasm in French history. And her dark, tragic figure will forever remain a reminder of the monstrous price that sometimes must be paid to preserve a crown.